morning. I'm Moira Hendricks from Bayshore Elementary School in Manatee County. There are several reasons for selecting Two Thanksgivings by Heather Lynn Banks for the My Challenge students. They're third grade students who really need a great deal of practice with several reading strategies. The third grade team informed me that they were working on compare, contrast, and sequencing of events, and I decided to complement their classroom work with our work in Y Reads in the afternoon. I selected Two Thanksgivings from Reading A to Z, and we're very lucky at the school to have Reading A to Z and 2 subscriptions of Rad's Kids. Several of the reasons for selecting this passage, in addition to the fact that they are strategies that were being taught at the school, was there was a comfortable level for our students to be reading at. All of them were reading at guided reading level L or above, and so they found this very comfortable. It was a mixture of nonfiction and fiction, and I do believe that third grade students need to be able to distinguish between these two genres. It was a great passage for me to teach text annotation and test-taking skills. And it also was a very timely November selection because there was a great deal of discussion at that point about Thanksgiving traditions, and the illustrations were excellent. Both the students and I really enjoyed them. I was also able, because we had 2 classroom subscriptions for Rad's Kids, to customize assignments for my students so that at any point during the 4-day lesson plan, they could listen to the selection, read the selection, or take quizzes on the selection. The first day's lesson plan first started with some building of background information. I took a world globe from the media center where our classes are held, and I taught the students to locate the Atlantic Ocean, Canada, and England. I then brought in a calendar and demonstrated how the Thanksgiving in Canada took place in October, and the Thanksgiving in the United States took place in November. I brought in a cornucopia, the symbol of plenty, and we discussed the fact that the cornucopia had a long history. Then, after building background knowledge, I did pre-teach some vocabulary, very much in the same way as the challenge manual suggests. I looked at several verbs: to explore, to settle, to survive, and to harvest. And then I talked about the nouns that were associated with them. The students had a great deal of trouble with the concept of to harvest, and we did need to elaborate on that. As far as traditions, we defined it, and then we did some connections to personal life. The first day's lesson plan continued with previewing some of the illustrations and making predictions about what they thought might be happening. And making predictions is an important skill for third grade students to develop. I explained the mixture of fiction and nonfiction and the fact that in this passage, the writer decided to switch back and forth between nonfiction and fiction. And then I asked the students to silently read pages 3 to 5, and we discussed why these early pages represented the fiction genre. For the second day, we started by reviewing vocabulary that I had posted on a whiteboard, and I asked the students to retell the story. Retelling a story is an important reading strategy also, and it helps students who have been absent get caught up in the lesson plan. To my visual aid, I added to blurt, which is found on page 9, and made sure that we gave examples so the students really understood it before we started to read on that page. I demonstrated to the students with the use of a transparency how to make annotations in the margin as far as compare, contrast, and sequencing of events. I then asked the students to read pages 7 to 10, and I asked open-ended questions at that point. For example, what might have been some of the Thanksgiving traditions that the Americans brought to Canada in the 1700s? I'm trying to train my third grade students to find the evidence in the text and not always to make connections to themselves, because they do like to digress quite a bit. And I keep saying, play detective, get and find the evidence for me. I then asked the students to read a number of pages from 11 to 14, and I provided very large posters of the timeline and demonstrated with the use of a transparency how the students would complete it in pairs. Then at that point, they completed the timeline, and then I put them up on a transparency so that we could discuss the sequence of events and make some corrections. This is the timeline that I gave them, and they really, with some prompting, did not have any trouble finding how to label 1578, 1700s, 1872, and 1957. For the third day's lesson plan, we reviewed the vocabulary one more time and the timeline. We do know from research that it takes multiple practices before the students internalize vocabulary in a way so that they can really recognize it and use it. I provided the students with a compare-contrast graphic organizer, and I modeled with the transparency how to find the first similarity and difference found on page 3. The students then were asked to work in pairs and complete the compare-contrast graphic organizer. And we shared out the graphs with the projector transparency, and we made some required corrections at that point. This is the graphic organizer that we used. The students did not have any trouble finding the similarities between the two countries' traditions, but they really did struggle finding the differences, and that's where my modeling came in and helped them a great deal. For the fourth day lesson plan, I made sure that the students had gone in and they had read or listened to and taken the quiz online. And it's very, very easy for a teacher to be able to log in and find out that information on the customized assignments. I then downloaded from Reading A to Z a multiple choice quiz, and we worked on test-taking skills at that point. The students have a great deal of trouble distinguishing between multiple choice items, especially with all of the above, none of the above, and multiple choice items that are very similar. I think it's important for the students to be able to develop these strategies, and then I asked the students to silently reread the passage. When they felt comfortable and automatic with the decoding and the intonation, I pulled them aside one by one and we did some fluency practice. I never do any round robin reading, and I never ask the students to read out loud in a cold way. It's important to distinguish between comprehension lessons and fluency practice and not to get the two confused. Then at that point, at the end of the fourth day lesson plan, I allowed the students to act out the roles of Uncle Ed, Curtis, and Mom.